ဆရာကြီးရောက်နေပြီဗျာ hello hello professor
Reverend, can you hear me?
yeah we hear you
I
professor
can't
very
hear
clear.
you.
Oh, really we can hear you very clearly. Hello, what is happening? Hello professor, can you hear?
Venerable Rattasar, can you hear me?
Yeah we hear you very clearly professor. I think you are mute
But
from your
I
side.
cannot hear you.
Hello. Hello professor, can you hear? No, I think so. Hello.
We will start. First of all, very good evening to all the participants. I should thank Myanmar Students Association of Sri Lanka for inviting me for its annual research seminar. And then this is the 7th annual Makutaram Research Seminar. And every Vassana season, Myanmar Student Association in Sri Lanka organize this very useful work. So I congratulate you all for organizing this rainy season research seminar in which we can share ideas and discuss, particularly so that we can improve our research. Today we will be discussing textual, conceptual, and sociological study in Buddhism. As you can see, it touches very important three aspects of Buddhist research: textual and conceptual and sociological study. As you can understand, I will not be able to give you a very comprehensive analysis of these three areas. And also, most of you being advanced research students, and also some of you already holding higher academic qualifications like MPhil and PhD. I don't think you need A to Z type, from the very beginning. So I will only touch, some of the important points. But let me begin with by asking the question, what is a research? Why do we do research? What is the purpose of research? In fact, it is important for us to know why we conduct research. Now, very briefly, I can say that research is meant to produce knowledge. Now, when we say producing knowledge or knowledge production, I think this is something you need to think deeply. Usually what happens is, as students, when we start studying, we acquire knowledge, we gain knowledge. So from teachers, from reading books, by taking part in classroom discussion, we acquire knowledge. However, when it comes to research, our role changes to some extent. Of course, we don't cease, we don't stop studying. We will be studying all alone in our whole life. But when we talk about research, our role changes from being a mere acquirer of knowledge. Our role changes producer of knowledge. Now, I think this point has to be kept in mind by all of us. The reason is this: when we say we do a research, when we produce a research dissertation or thesis, research paper, it does not have a justification if we are not sure that particular writing has produced any new knowledge to the academic world. Now, when we say new knowledge, this is from the very beginning, this is something very, very interesting. I mean, the almost all participants being Buddhist studies students, and the good number of participants being Buddhist monks. In the very first sermon, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Buddha says following: Pubbe ananussutesu dhammesu chakkung udapadi. Pubbe ananussutesu dhammesu chakkung udapadi. Buddha says that chakkung udapadi, jnanang udapadi, panya udapadi, and it goes on like that. So Buddha says that I, or knowledge, arose in things that have not heard before. Pubbe ananussutesu dhammesu chakkung udapadi. I think if we use the research language, what the Buddha says here is something very fascinating. I mean, this is the Buddha's first sermon. Now, imagine if the Buddha did not have anything new to say to the world. What is the point of his offering to teach 5 Panchavagya Bhikkhu? I mean, if he did not have anything new to say, what is the justification? Why should Panchavaggiya Bhikkhu, these 5 ascetics, why should they listen to the Buddha? We know the story. Actually, according to the traditional story, as we are told in the Vinaya Pitaka, at some point they departed. When Buddha started taking bath and having a meal, they thought that Siddhartha has deviated, so he will never achieve enlightenment. So they left. However, Buddha striving all alone, then when Buddha achieved enlightenment, Buddhahood, and then Buddha visited these 5 people, it was not very easy for the Buddha to convince these 5 people, 5 early friends. It was not easy for him to convince them that the Buddha had something worthwhile to say. And they said that having given up your padhana energy and getting into some kind of relaxed life, how can we believe that you attain this great the great state? And Buddha had a hard time in convincing them. However, what the Buddha said, Pubbe ananusutesu dhammesu, I'm going to tell you something that you have not heard before. Now, this is the justification. Now, I think this is something very good for us to bring into our own Buddhist research, particularly in the field of research. But what I am saying is not confined only to Buddhist studies. Any research study you do has to be producing some kind of new knowledge. Now, when we say new knowledge, it can be a kind of new information, new argument in support of something, new argument in order to disprove something. It can be different depending on different aspects of research. Nevertheless, it is very important to remember that in a research, what we are really doing is we are producing new knowledge. Now, when you report something, you are not producing new knowledge. When you summarize something, you are not producing new knowledge. When you describe something, you are not producing new knowledge. So summarizing, describing, paraphrasing, all types of things. I'm not saying that those things are not important. Actually, those things are very important, but still they are not research. So research is something that you produce, something you bring in new. Now, then only it makes you worthwhile academic person, worthy of MPhil or PhD or higher recognition. So, this, I think this basic idea, it will be very interesting for us to keep in mind. Now, let me move into 3 areas that I am supposed to speak to you today: textual, conceptual, and sociological study in Buddhism. Now, we start with textual study and textual research. In fact, textual research is perhaps the most important aspect of Buddhist studies. I say it is the most important because historically we can see that how texts were preserved and how texts were uh, understood, interpreted by the tradition. Now, this is how from generation to generation the Buddhist text reached us. So without text, it is not very easy. It is almost impossible for us to do any kind of meaningful Buddhist study. And Buddhism, from the very beginning, we know that from the start of Theravada tradition with the first Sanghayana, we know that how the Tripitaka, 3 Pitakas were gradually formulated. in the first Sangayana, Vinaya and the Sutta were recited and then determined. However, subsequently, we have what we call today Khuddaka Nikaya, fifth Nikaya in the Sutta, developing gradually. And there is academic debate whether Abhidhamma was recited in the first Sangayana. I do not want to go into that debate, but if you read Venerable Buddha Ghosha's Attasalini commentary, in the Attasalini commentary, Abhidhamma commentary, Buddha Ghosha produces a lot of reasons for us to believe that Abhidhamma was recited in the first Sangayana, but we don't need to go into that debate in this evening. However, and then texts were transmitted orally by memory, at least for about 500 years in the Buddhist tradition. Texts were transmitted orally, and in Sri Lankan history, we have what is called in the Theravada history, it is considered to be the fourth Sangayana. Now, fourth Sangayana is also called Potthaka Sangayana. Potthaka Sangayana means that is when the texts were written in palm leaf as palm leaf manuscript. So up to that point, texts were transmitted from memory from teacher to pupils, and in that manner. And then the text, in the sense of written text, started according to Sri Lankan history. From the first century AD, actually just the very beginning of first century AD, so roughly about 500 years. But then, even after that, texts were kept in memory, and memorization is an important aspect of traditional learning, as you, particularly from Myanmar, know. In 1954 to 56, when we had Chatta Sangayana, the sixth Sangayana, and there were venerable monks who remembered all three Pitakas. And then there were many monks who remembered one Pitaka or two Pitaka, and then there were also monks who remembered all three Pitakas. So that means in Myanmar, we have a very great tradition of memorizing, and there's still that tradition continues. And actually, sometimes I get amused when I see that Burmese students not only memorize text, they also memorize examination answers also. So, but their memory is very good, actually. Anyway, now when we come to textual studies, I think something very, very important thing is the first step will be constructing a text. And then next step will be translating text. And translating text goes along with interpretation of the text. Now, interpretation is associated with understanding of the text. Now, although this may sound fairly simple, there is a very complex uh, activity going on in our mind, in our brain, when we read the text and we understand. We reading a text is something, physical. But when we say understanding is something related to our mind. Now, the moment we understand, we interpret it and understand it. So, understanding and interpretation inseparable. Now, when I speak, you hear it, and then you understand it. But you understand it means, it goes into your brain, and then, you make sense out of that. So that's a psychological, physical, psychological, basically psychological process. We understand what we read. So therefore, textual understanding, textual interpretation go together. In textual study, construction of the text is very important. Now again, we go to a familiar example of Chatta Sangayana. Now you know that in the Chatta Sangayana, the executors of Sangayana, the monks, and they were coming from larger number of monks coming from Myanmar itself, and then the other Theravada monks coming from Thailand, Sri Lanka, and other countries. We know that they discussed text, particularly they discussed certain terms, whether they were the acceptable term or not. Because historically we know that when the things were kept in memory, of course, memory is in a way very good thing. It's a collective thing. Memory is asserted by collective recitation. Now, the important thing is collective recitation is one single person cannot change it. Because when you recite something collectively, whole group gathered recite it. So even if one person, by mistake makes a change, right away it is known. It is very easy to detect. However, I mean, in a way, we can say that memorization is even a better way to keep a text, because in a written text, if you really want, you can write it down and remove one palm leaf, and then you can insert another palm leaf, actually. You can imagine. However, memorization is, in that sense, even more reliable, because memory is also always a collective memory. Even today in the traditional setting, particularly in Buddhist monasteries in Myanmar, and I have seen after, midday meal, monks get together and, very loud voice, they keep on chanting what they have learned. Now, that is, some type of collective exercise. So in a collective exercise, keeping text without changes, the very quite reliable. However, what happened in the Chatta Sangayana is some kind of reconstruction of the text. Now, this is why in the Chatta Sangayana edition, and also you take PTS edition, Pali Text Society edition, you have a lot of variant readings recorded. Now, the meaning of variant readings recorded means actually you can see what are the variant readings and whether a variant reading could make better sense to the text. So, therefore, in order for the expert to be able to judge in editorial process, we record variant readings. And then, so the construction. However, how do we construct? How do we determine which term is the correct term? In okay,
Professor.
uh, connection got the disconnected. Okay,
Yes.
you can hear me, I hope.
Yeah, we
All
can
right.
hear you.
So what happens is, when we are trying to construct a text, constructing a text always involves some kind of interpretation, understanding. Accordingly, if we have dubious, doubtful reading at some point, we try to determine a better term. Now we know that when it comes to textual studies, scholars, the debate quite a lot about these points, depending on each person's understanding. So therefore, in the textual study, construction of the text and reconstruction of the text is something very important. Now, this is why we have the Chatta Sangayana edition. We have in Sri Lanka Buddha Jayanti edition, and then English speaking world, we have Pali Text Society edition. I mean, these editions are, of course, 99%, I would say, similar. not a big difference. However, that remaining 1% can be, the debatable issues. So therefore, textual study is, something very, very important. And in a textual study, particularly when it comes to a particular sutta or particular text, you can see that how this textual interpretation, how it is important. Uh, I don't want to take too much time, but let me give you one example from modern, the scholarship. Now, in modern scholarship, particularly not a Theravada text, but all of you know about Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika. This is written in Sanskrit language, and it is very, very interesting from the very beginning. From the very beginning means starting from around 4th, 5th centuries. Now we are talking about something like for 2000 years. This text has been interpreted by various scholars in several different ways. So right after Nagarjuna's philosophy was, this text was interpreted by two groups of Nagarjuna's, you can say, followers. We know that these two groups are Swatantrika, and the other groups is Prasangika group. I hope you know about these things. I don't have time to go in detail. However, this shows that two major groups are there at a very early stage, according to which Nagarjuna was understood. And then from that early period, when we come to modern period today, we know that it's very interesting. The same two types of interpretation are being carried in different ways, same two debates. In a way, I remember when we read T.R.V. Murthy, of course, he wrote in 1950s, his analysis of Madhyamaka philosophy. Okay, philosophy of Buddhism. And now there, T.R.V. Murthy gives some type of interpretation to Nagarjuna. However, when we see particularly scholars like A.K. Warder and also David J. Kalupahana, Sri Lankan scholar, we can see that they gave a totally different interpretation. So according to these scholars, Nagarjuna it will be not very easy to consider Nagarjuna to be a Mahayanist. Several years ago, now maybe about 30, 40 years ago, A.K. Warder wrote a very interesting short paper. The title of the paper Is Nagarjuna a Mahayanist? So his argument in this paper is he suggests that as far as Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Nagarjuna's main text is concerned, Nagarjuna cannot be described as a Mahayanist. Now, this is a very revolutionary idea. And then subsequently, after 2 decades later, in 1990s, when Kalupahana, Professor Kalupahana retranslated Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and then he proposed that, in fact, Nagarjuna, there is no evidence in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika that Nagarjuna presented Mahayana philosophy, but Nagarjuna was presenting the Buddha's own philosophy. Now, these are very drastic interpretations about one particular scholar. Now, the important thing is, in interpreting a scholar, there are certain limits. Limits are basically you have to go according to a text. In interpreting a text, you have to go according to the accepted grammar. Okay, so you have to assume that the original author has followed the grammar of the language. And also, we have to make sure that we understand how original author, in what sense, use the concept. So therefore, you can see that textual interpretation is, a very, very challenging thing. It is challenging because today what we have is the text, but we don't have the author. Now, this is true for Nagarjuna, and it is even more true for the Buddha. Now, we have the word of the Buddha in the text, but we do not have the Buddha. Now, you remember when Buddha was living, whenever there was a problem of understanding bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, and upasakas, upasikas went to the Buddha and asked for clarification. Venerable sir, what is the meaning of this? Now, Buddha would explain the meaning and then spoke those words, and you attend nirvana. And then Buddha Buddha did not name, as you know, Buddha did not name a particular person. Buddha said, Dhamma and the Vinaya. Dhamma I taught, and the Vinaya I prescribed will be your teacher after I am gone. Now, now it's a very interesting thing. Buddha says, my Dhamma will be your teacher. Then what is Dhamma? Now, this is why in the first Sanghayana, the Arahants got together and chanted Dhamma and the Vinaya and fixed, okay, this is the Dhamma, this is the Sutta, and this is the Vinaya. So Dhamma and the Vinaya had to be fixed, and that is why in the first Sanghayana, the Arahant did that. Because if Buddha says that, okay, after I am gone, Dhamma is your teacher, then so we have to consult the Dhamma. We have to consult the Vinaya in order to know the answer for a particular thing. So it is very necessary that we have Dhamma and the Vinaya in a very clear manner. Otherwise, you can't solve that problem. Now, here is very interesting. Buddha said something that is what is called Maha Apadesa. Again, please refer. I hope you all of you know what Maha Apadesa. Great indicators. Now, the summary of the Maha Apadesa is Buddha says that if ever you have somebody comes and say, okay, Buddha said this, but there was no anybody else there. I am the only one who heard this. Now Buddha asks, what should you do, whether you accept or reject? Buddha says, no, don't accept, don't reject. Study that idea very well. And having studied that idea very well, what you need to do is compare, put it in the sutta, put it in the Vinaya, compare it with the Vinaya, compare it with the Dhamma. And then if it compares with the Dhamma and the Vinaya, if it tallies with the Dhamma and the Vinaya, if it agrees with the Dhamma and the Vinaya, then you accept it as my word. And then if it doesn't tally with the Dhamma and the Vinaya, then you reject it. Now, there is a very interesting principle functioning here. Okay, the very interesting principle functioning here is what is called the principle of coherence. Principle of coherence. I will talk you a little bit about coherence when when I discuss with you conceptual and conceptual studies of Buddhism. So the coherence is actually the idea that the entire content of the sutta and the Vinaya are quite agreeing with each other, cohere. It is like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, in a jigsaw puzzle, you take, like what we give to small children. Now, there are particular places. And then if you put all the pieces into right place, then you can see a picture, a boy or a girl or forest or whatever. But then, like a jigsaw puzzle, you put all the pieces in proper place, and then comes a coherent picture. So the coherence is, something like that. So Buddha said that if it coheres with what I taught, Dhamma and the Vinaya, then you accept. Now, here it's very interesting in a textual study. Your understanding and your interpretation is, something very, very important. And even now, I will be talking a little bit to you about conceptual research. Now, conceptual research or any other research, you cannot do without primarily doing a textual study, because texts are the only things that we have today, that we believe to be the Buddha Vachana, word of the Buddha. Now, without studying the word of the Buddha, you have to understand that we cannot do any other research. So, therefore, it is very important that we do textual studies. And even in textual studies themselves, we have to know the importance of studying Buddhist text in Pali language. Now, among the modern scholars, there is debate whether the Pali is the language spoken by Buddha. Some people say that Pali was made in Sri Lanka, and it was what the Theravadins made, and things like that. Actually, this debate is a separate subject if you want to study. But I remember something very interesting recently. All of you have heard about Professor Richard Gomrich, who is great Pali scholar. Uh, you know, Not very long ago, he wrote this book, uh, Buddhism and Pali. It's a not a big book, very small book, Buddhism and Pali. This book was published, in fact, 2018, almost 8 years ago. And in this book, Professor Richard Gomrich suggests that, in fact, the Pali language we are using is the language most probably that the Buddha spoke. Okay. Now, I'm not going to give a judgment about it. But what I would like to say to you is, if the Pali is not exactly the language spoken by the Buddha, I would say that Pali is the closest to what the Buddha used. So therefore, Pali, considered to be by historians of language, Pali as a language belonging to the Middle Indic period. So that naturally, that existed in the Madhya Pradesh in India. So Pali can be more reliably, we can believe that Pali comes very close to the word of the Buddha. But we know that there were so many dialects, so many sub-languages during the time of the Buddha, particularly in a society. Even today in Indian, the society, they have about 12 major languages, and then about 100 next to major languages. And then there are thousands, more than 1,000 regional and provincial languages in India. Even today, in the age where we have the globalization and communication, spreading together. But so you can imagine during the time of the Buddha, there may have been many, many dialects. So, but the Buddha used this Magadhika Vohara, the language spoken in the Magadha area, where the capital city of that area. Anyway, the point I am trying to make is, if we want to study the word of the Buddha, it is very important that we study in Pali. And then also it is important we study in Sanskrit, because it was put into Sanskrit very early period, particularly by Sarvastivada, Sautrantika. These schools and many other schools started using Sanskrit as their language. And then about 300 to 400 years after the parinirvana of the Buddha, the Pali canon, the word of the Buddha, went into China. And very early Chinese Agama text, and they were translated around within the first 500 to 600 years after the parinirvana of the Buddha. So we have what is called Chinese Agama to be again, another very early type of text. Now, you know that usually we use the concept early Buddhism. Now, this early Buddhism is a term that was coined by Western scholars when they started studying, the word of the Buddha. In the traditional Buddhist countries, we never had a concept like early Buddhism. However, what they mean by early Buddhism is, the type of, the Buddhist ideas that are presented in the early Pali texts like Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, Sutta Nipata, and all that. However, even within the Theravada tradition, the texts like Buddha Vansa, Apadana, Charyapitaka, and then coming to later tradition, commentaries, Attakatha, and Tika, these things are considered to be somewhat later. So therefore, this early, later distinction is there. The important thing is when we look at concept of early Buddhism, at some point, basically by the term early Buddhism, only Pali canon was understood. However, today when we say early Buddhism, it academically speaking, it is not only Pali canon. It also, people include particularly the Chinese Agama, and also some of the Sanskrit, translated texts into Sanskrit. So in other words, the concept of early Buddhism kind of has expanded today. It doesn't mean only Pali, but still we can see that if you look at the history of the Pali tradition, from the first Sangayana to the second Sangayana to the third Sangayana, and from the Sangayanas, the spreading into third Sangayana to, the Myanmar, Thailand, that area we call Suvarnabhumi. Buddhist text went there, and the text came to Sri Lanka, and then they were preserved in the center called Mahavihara. And then again around the 10th century, 11th century, during the King Anvaratha or Anuruddha, these texts were again, taken to Myanmar and compared. So, we have a very, very long historical tradition relevant to textual studies. I mean, I don't want to go into, a lot of detail into it, but what I'm trying to tell you is textual study provide the basis for not only for textual studies, but all other types of studies. Now, luckily, today we have text edited and re-edited by scholars. Now, if you take, for example, Pali Text Society editions, very early Pali texts were edited by actually non-Buddhist British and German scholars who studied Pali in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, Thailand, these countries, they edited. So you can imagine that there could be many challenging instances, many dubious, doubtful textual readings, many questionable textual readings when these early scholars, of course, they did a very great service. When PTS started printing and publishing Pali text, in fact, the Pali texts have not been printed and published even in traditional Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and these countries. The traditional Buddhist countries even started little later. Some texts were printed, some texts were not. But then in the English-speaking world, in the Roman letters, Buddhist texts have been edited, and then they were translated. But there are a lot of issues related to these translations. Now, more recently, I did some research on Milinda Panya. Now, Milinda Panya is, according to Myanmar tradition, Milinda Panya is included in the canon, in the Tripitaka, but in some, like Sri Lanka tradition, it is not included. However, Milinda Panya is undoubtedly one of the very, very early text, okay? Now, in the Milinda Panya, you have early Chinese version. It is called Nagasena Bhikshu Sutra, not Milinda Panya. Nagasena Bhikshu Sutra. Now, Nagasena Bhikshu Sutra is in Chinese, and it may have been translated from Pali or Sanskrit or any other language. And what I'm going to tell you is more recently in the modern time, um, um, Milinda Panya was translated into English by Rhys Davids, Mrs. Rhys Davids, I think. And so she translated Milinda Panya into English around late 90s, 20s. And interestingly, in 1950s, roughly about 30 years later, I.B. Horner, by that time she was the president of Polytech Society, she translated again. Now, interesting thing is, for my own research, I consulted these both translations, Rhys David's translation in 1920s and I.B. Horner's translation in 1950s. An interesting thing is when I examine these translations, of course, we can see that I.B. Horner's translation is an improvement over Rhys David's translation. However, in my own research, I found several places where both translators have gone, I think, have gone wrong. Their interpretation, their translation is not accurate. Maybe my translation may be also not accurate. That has to be examined by some other scholars. So what I'm trying to tell you is this. Textual interpretation and translation doesn't mean that you can produce one final conclusive translation unchallengeable. No, nothing like that. In the academic world, it is very important. Any textual translation, any textual construction, any textual reconstruction can be challenged, remains open to be challenged. You can always come up with a new translation, new interpretation. I gave you the example earlier, Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamik Karika. It has been translated into English at least by 8 or 9 scholars. But 8 or 9 scholars, when they translate, they don't say the same thing. They give different interpretations. Now, who is correct, who is not correct, academics and the scholars will have to be very carefully judged. It has to be judged. So the textual interpretation is, technically speaking, unending. You can always come up with a new interpretation if you, by reading a text. So therefore, let me move into other two aspects. By discussing textual research, I wanted to highlight to you textual research is very fundamental. And conceptual research or philosophical research or comparative research, any kind of research we do later, subsequently, is really dependent on how we understand a particular text. Okay, so anyway, we can go on discussing, but I will wind up that section. Let me move into anyway, by the way, I will be go on talking maybe another up to about 8:30 or something, and then please prepare your questions. If you have any questions, we can discuss further. But at the moment, I will not stop for questions. I will move into the next section of conceptual research. Now, what is the conceptual research? What is the concept? Now, the moment we use the English word concept, it comes from the English verb called conceive. Conceive. Now, conceiving is also related to childbirth, but we are not talking about that aspect, but we are talking about conceiving in the psychological sense. So the moment we talk about conceptual research or concept, we are talking about something that is generated in our mind. Now, if you want to further highlight the concept, then we highlight the concept by using word. So therefore, our concepts are revealed or articulated by words, so by language. So at some point we can say language from one point of view. Another point of view, we can say a concept. Now, when we say a concept, now we can say concept of Four Noble Truth. There we are using the idea behind it. However, we can also know that when we say Four Noble Truth, it has three words. We are using English language. In Myanmar language, we use other terms. In Sinhala language, we use other terms, like that. In language, we are using different terms. So that is one aspect of concept. Now, basically, we talk about concept means what is the idea behind these words. When we say concept, the moment you open your mouth, we are using concept. Now, in order to understand this from the Buddhist point of view, you look at again the first sermon of the Buddha, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta of the Buddha. Now, when the Buddha started, the teaching Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Dve me bhikkhave anta pabbajitena na sevitabba, and so on. Yochayang kama sukhallikanu yogu. Now, all these things, bhikkhave, anta, pabbajitena, na sevitabba, kama sukallikanu yoga, atta kilamatanu yoga, and then te ubho ante anupagam majjhima patipada. Now, all these are words you can hear, okay? But then just imagine when the first Panchavagya bhikkhu listened to what the Buddha said, when Buddha was uttering these words, when these words come into the ears of the Panchavagya bhikkhu. Now, this is how a concept is created. Okay, we have to believe that they understood. When the Buddha calls them bhikkhu, they may bhikkhave anta. And when the Buddha used the word anta, extreme, and Kamasukallikanu yoga, Attakila Matanu yoga. So like that, we can see that, different types of concepts. So the words, concept mean the same thing. Word mean part of the language. Concept means what we derive in our mind through the words. So those are concepts. Now, when you do a conceptual study, actually, I know that a lot of graduate students study Buddhism, particularly a lot of Myanmar students studying Buddhism. A lot of students go for conceptual studies. So I have seen they do conceptual studies on lobha, dosa, kopa, moha, paramita. All these are conceptual studies. All these are they study conceptual, they may do conceptual studies. Now, so which means that conceptual study is a very popular form of study in the Buddhist studies. However, we need to think about what are the methodological things we have to think about when we do a conceptual study. I would like to show you a couple of aspects. Now, particularly when we use a concept, a linguistic concept used in the language, these concepts have a background. Concept have a history. When we study the concept, we have to know the background. We have to know the history. Now, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, we use the word Brahmana. I'm just trying to give you one example. We use the word Brahmana. Now, Brahmana is not a word created by the Buddha. Brahmana was a word that was used during that society. And then Buddha uses the term Brahmana in the regular popular sense, referring to one type of people who belong to Brahmana caste. Now, this is the basic idea. However, it is very, very interesting how the Buddha used this concept. On the one hand, Buddhist literature uses the concept of Brahmana in the regular sense, one segment of Indian society. Okay, all right. But then look at Dhammapada Brahmana Vagga. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Brahmana Vagga of the Dhammapada. That is the last Vagga of the Dhammapada. There, what is the collection Dhammapada? Actually, there Buddha says, Tamahang Brumi Brahmanang. I call him a Brahmana. But there, again, you look at Dhammapada Brahmana Vagga, you can see that Buddha giving a very, very new interpretation, new meaning to this word. So it's a very good example. On the one hand, at one level, Brahman is a social concept which refers to a group of people who belong to a particular caste. However, when Buddha addresses Mahakachana or Venerable Mahakassapa or somebody, Brahmana, you Brahmins, I mean, Buddha could not be meaning Mahakassapa, Kachano, or any other disciple to be belonging to the Brahmin caste in the social sense. Buddha was obviously very clearly Buddha was used in the term Brahmana in a different sense. Now, this is a very good example. You can see that concepts have different meanings. Concepts have different histories. How these histories were made gradually. So when you look at the teaching of the Buddha, you can see that the very same concept has been used to give different meanings. Therefore, it is very important thing to see how Buddha made use of the concept that were already there in the Indian tradition. Now, think about this very carefully. When the Buddha wanted to teach his Dhamma to people, five Panchavagya Bhikkhu first and others, you think that Buddha could create a new language in order to teach his new Dhamma? No, Buddha can never do that. If Buddha were to create a totally new language, nobody will understand him, right? Because Buddha had to use the language that people were using. Okay, Buddha cannot create a new language because nobody will understand new language. Only Buddha will understand it. So, but on the other hand, the moment Buddha is using the already existing language has for words meanings given already. Now, it is an enormously difficult task for someone to use old language and try to say something new. Now, Buddha was faced with this difficulty. According to my reading, we have a story that after that, in Buddhahood, Buddha thought about teaching the Dhamma, and the story says that Bhagava apposukko ahosi. Buddha felt discouraged. When the Buddha thought about the world, Buddha felt discouraged. How can I teach this world? Actually, this problem, although it is not exactly spelled out in that manner, there what the Buddha thinks, I'm sure, is Buddha was thinking about the language problem. How to use the language, what kind of language to be used. And during that period, the Brahminic religion was the main religion. Language was mainly used to describe Brahmanic religious ideas. And then, of course, there were many other religious teachers, their ideas, but the Buddha was not there. Now, how could Buddha overcome this difficulty is a very, very important thing. Now, this is why Buddha had to give new meanings. Buddha used the word Atma, but not only say Atma in the Brahmanic sense, when Buddha said Attanang Aveseyat, Attadipa Viharata, you can see that Buddha doesn't mean Atma in the Brahmanic sense. Buddha was using it in some different sense. Now, I can give you any amount of examples. Conceptual study is a very challenging study because, we are using concepts that have histories. They have existed before. Okay. I will give you another example where Buddha seems to have created a new word. For example, if you take Paticca Samuppada, Sanskrit form is Pratitya Samuppada. I think, according to my understanding, this is a term that was not existing in any religious tradition, philosophical tradition by the time of the Buddha. Now, this appears to be a very new concept created by the Buddha. Paticca Samuppada, Pratitya Samutpada. Now, Paticca, Pratitya. Now, idea again is new. Of course, although you have to use the other terms to denote it, to describe it, but basically when the Buddha used the term Paticca Samuppada, the Buddha was using something very new. And then Buddha said that it is very difficult to understand, very hard to understand Paticca. Now, when the Buddha said this, Venerable Ananda kind of took it very lightly. Ananda thought that, he could understand without, the much problem. But then Buddha said that, no, Ananda, it is not like that. It's very difficult to understand. Now, when we look at Paticca today, we also think that, it is not that difficult to understand. So why did the Buddha say that it is difficult to understand? Now, our situation today is different. We have studied Dhamma in so many discourses. We are familiar with that. However, for the people during the time of the Buddha, for the Buddha to give this new idea to the society, it was not very easy to convey the idea by existing language. So he created a new concept, and then he gave, thereby Buddha gave new meaning through that new creation. So you can see that again, conceptual study is at some level textual study. We get the words, we take the concepts from the text. So conceptual study at some level is actually textual study. So without textual study, you can't do conceptual study. Okay. Now, so that challenge has to be kept in mind. And when we come to doing actually the conceptual studies, it is a very, very interesting thing. There are different ways for us to do that. Now, for example, suppose you are doing a research on any concept. We take a concept of Vijnana. Everybody knows Vijnana. Now, how are you going to do the research on Vijnana? I think the very beginning point will be to examine as many as instances where the term Vijnana occurs, and then to see whether Vijnana occurs in these different contexts to give the same meaning or different meanings. Now, I don't want to go into detail, but we know that term Vijnana is being used in different contexts, in different senses, right? In order to know that, you have to really look at each concept and how it has been used. Now, today, of course, with the technology, not like olden days, you can, you can collect all the instances of term Vijnana occurs within a couple of minutes. You go to the textual base and, you type Vijnana, and, all the instances where Vijnana is used, you can get. However, that does not mean that you know about the different context. Now, reading a sutta from beginning to the end in a particular context gives you the proper meaning and the proper context to understand the meaning. Now, suppose without that context, you just go to Google and you just go to some kind of program and get all the instances of where Vijnana has been used. No, you will have to go back to each and every instance and read that paragraph or the context, I mean, sutta, and to see in which sense this particular term. So at the end, maybe you go through again all these things and you will be able to classify, okay, in these places, Vijnana used in one sense, in then another set, Vijnana used another sense, in another set of Vijnana use in another sense, So like that, you can make an analysis. Without doing that type of analysis, you can't do a conceptual study. I remember several years ago, of course, a lot of Myanmar graduate student studies. I remember one, I think he's a Korean monk, Korean student in Sri Lanka studied. He studied the idea, the term pajanati. Now we know that panya comes from pajanati. Pajanati is the verb, panya is the noun. Now, it is a very, very interesting thing. This particular student collected all the instances of pajanati occurring in the entire Sutta Pitaka. And then he analyzed into various different categories. I happened to be the examiner of that dissertation, not the supervisor. When I examined it, I found that it was a quite fascinating study, actually, because he did a very thorough, comprehensive study of this particular verb, pajanati, and then what it exactly means, because we have janati, pajanati, sampajanati, vijanati, sanjanati. I mean, from janati, we have so many variants in Pali discourses. Pajanati is only one. But then for him to do this research and come out, his analysis was very interesting. Now, I just said that to you to get, some kind of idea. Now, another very important thing when we do conceptual study is you have to be very careful when you take a Pali term and then if you are studying, if you are writing your dissertation in English, sometimes, you tend to say, okay, you take vijnana and then you take the English word consciousness. And you set up the research vijnana, or within brackets, or stroke, we say consciousness. Now, this is very challenging thing. You take Pali word vijnana and then you take the English word consciousness, and then you think that vijnana equals consciousness, or consciousness equals vijnana. But how can you decide that? How can you make a decision like that? How can you come to a conclusion vijnana is consciousness? Now, looking at very superficially, as I said earlier, vijnana is a Pali term used by several thousand years ago in the Buddhist text. But consciousness is an English word. Now we have to remember that any language in the world arises within a culture, within a setup. So any language has a history. The words of that language have a history. So, you can't get away from that contextual setup. Now, if you think that consciousness equals vijnana or vijnana equals consciousness, I think you cannot make that equation without making a very thorough examination of different nuances of consciousness and also the different uses of vijnana. Now, when you do that kind of thorough study, maybe you will find there are certain places vijnana equals consciousness is correct. But there can be certain other instances vijnana equals consciousness is not correct. I mean, in order to come to that knowledge, you really have to do a very thorough study. So therefore, this is another very important aspect of your research. when you try to, same thing, if you take a Pali concept and you translate into Burmese or translate into Sinhala or any other language, you can't simply take, the equation, this equals this. No, you have to come to that conclusion after doing a very thorough, the examination. Finally, to talk about when we do conceptual study, important aspect you can do will be to study the practical application, practical manifestation of that concept. Now, again, you can take Vijnana, or rather, you can take a concept like Metta, Karuna, or Parami. There are so many Pali Buddhist concepts. Those concepts have, in addition to the conceptual importance, they also have practical implication. Now, if you say Vipassana, if you say Samatha, we need to know the meaning. But at the same time, in that study, we need to also look at the practical aspect. Now, what I'm saying is when you do a conceptual study, practical aspect also is an important part of that research. You might be thinking, why, if we are doing a conceptual study, why do we have to go to practice? Of course, if you want, you can do only the conceptual part and not the practical part. But we know that, in Buddhist philosophy, basically, Buddha talks about these things, negative and positive, maybe Koda, Loba, Dosa, Moha, Mano, whatever, and also Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Daya, Anukampa, and, stuff like that. All these have practical implications. So therefore, practical side is also very important when you do conceptual study. However, if you think that the only the conceptual part is enough for your degree requirement, I mean, it is one thing. You can stop there your dissertation. But of course, as a student of religion, you can't stop at conceptual study. We need to really look at the practical application of that tradition. Okay, these are some of the ideas about conceptual study. Now, next 15 minutes or something, let me go into talk a little bit about what are the sociological study of Buddhist studies. What type of study we are talking about? Now, number one very important thing is we need to be very clearly understand what we mean by sociological study. Now, very often I see scholars claim that they do sociological studies, but they actually don't seem to understand what it means. Now, for example, let me take a very minor example. If you want to do some kind of research about observing 5 precepts, okay, observing 5 precepts, not killing, not stealing, that sort of thing. I have seen sometimes people say, okay, Burma is a Buddhist country, 94% people in Burma are, Myanmar are Buddhist, therefore, Burmese people follow 5 precepts. Is that true? How do you decide? Of course, it is true that you take statistics, you can say that yes, Burmese people, 94% are Buddhist. But does that mean that all 94% people don't kill, don't steal, don't drink, don't? I mean, how can you decide that? You see, the moment you make a social related claim that particular society people are like this, it is very important to remember, in order to do that, you have to really do a sociological study or go to society. I mean, I don't want to go into details of how to do a sociological research. We need to talk more about it. We don't have time to do that. But what is important is we need to know the distinction between when we make a claim related to society, we need to have reliable evidence to say that. Now, simply taking statistics. Okay, 94% of the Burmese are Buddhist. By definition, Buddhist means, you observe 5 precepts, and then you conclude that, okay, all Burmese people observe 5 precepts, which obviously is a false statement, because there are people who cannot stop killing. There are other people who cannot stop stealing. I mean, we know in society. Now, if you really want to do, how do people do observe 5 precepts, then you have to really go into the society, maybe interview people, talk to people, take other, like, police reports and everything. How many people get caught in Myanmar for stealing? How many percentage of those people are Buddhist and how many are others? That type of statistics you can get. Very often, maybe the countries have. In Sri Lanka, we have a very good system of statistics. So every year, you can take those statistics and see how many murders took place, how many theft, and you can get the statistic, and then you can get the analysis according to how many are Buddhist, how many are Christian, how many are Islam or something, how many are Sinhala, how many are Tamil, like that, different ethnic groups. So you have to have those things. Now, when I talk about sociological studies in Buddhism, all of you know about Buddhism and Society by Michael Spiro. Of course, this is a very old research now, because it was done in 1950s and then it was published in 1960s. So almost about 60 to 70 years ago, this research was done. But still, this research is important research about Myanmar society, because nobody has ever since done a research on that scale. Of course, there are many sociological researchers on Burma, but this Michael Spiro's research is a very important one. Now, you see Michael Spiro in that research at some points talks about this donation, how donation is connected to Myanmar people. Now, dana, how Myanmar people practice dana. Now, this is a very interesting thing. Now, when Michael Spiro makes those assertions, you have to remember that he doesn't make assertions only by the book. According to the book, we can say that Buddhists giving dana. Of course, it is true. Dana is the first thing, Dana, Sila Bhavana, Dana Paramita. And, there's a lot of Buddhist textual, philosophical, religious stuff about Dana. However, based on those things, you cannot conclude how many percentage of people, how many percentage of Myanmar people, how much, what percentage of their monthly or annual income spent for Dana. Now, Michael Spiros does something like that. He says, this percentage of people, and they spend this percentage of money. It's very interesting. Now, what he said is about 60 years ago. Maybe somebody can again, do a research on dana, practice of dana in Myanmar, and see whether the conclusions that were drawn by Michael Spiro have changed today, or change for better, or change for worse. Now, people spend more of their money today. Now, we can't say by looking at. We have to go into the society. We can interview people. We can get information from the monasteries. And, there are many ways to gather information. And accordingly, we can conclude, okay, this is the ratio of, the Burmese Myanmar Buddhist, the making donations to the monasteries. And also you can look at what is the ratio of the donation for the Ciales, what is the the amount of for the monks, and like that. There are various ways to do that. But the point I am trying to highlight to you is that sociological research is something you cannot be doing only based on the text. Again, I want to highlight textual studies very important even for sociological studies. What the text says is very important, so you can't the give up textual study. However, in a sociological study, what is important is you look at what is happening in the society. Now, what is happening in the society can be changed from time to time. In fact, in the world, when people do sociological research, scholars, what they do is, suppose somebody has done research on Myanmar, 1990, that researcher may be coming again after 4 or 5 years later, and then he will observe again whether anything has drastically changed. Again, another 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. If the researcher is living, if we can, people visit their research field, research area from time to time, because sociological, what we call sociological facts, differ from time to time. So it's unlike textual fact. Of course, texts are there. We can say we can draw the textual, by reading and interpreting the text. But society is not like that. In order to do a research in society, you have to go to the society. There are different methods of, the things we don't have time to explain those things. However, the most important thing is the sociological research is a challenging thing. Purely conceptual research, you can just go to library and do that. You don't need to go to society. You just go to the library, you just sit in front of your computer, you can do that. However, sociological research, you have to go to field, you have to go to among the people, you have to get exposed to sun, you have to get exposed to rain, you have to travel here and there. You have to, live in those places. So, it's a kind of challenging thing, not very easy. Not very easy like conceptual study where you do but nevertheless, sociological study can be very, very useful, because judging a society only by the books is not very reliable. In order to understand the society, you have to really. Now, the same thing with, you say, Buddhist Vinaya, monastic Vinaya. Now, you go to the Vinaya and you take the monastic rules, and if you conclude, okay, all Buddhist monks observe these monastic rules. No, if you want to draw that conclusion, you have to really do different types of study. Okay, so sociological study, and then if you want to know more about sociological study, again, look at your own society. The book research done by Michael Spiro, even though it is a long time ago, it is a very important research. And then on Thai society, the scholar called Stanley Tambaya did a long time ago again world conquerors and world renouncers, 2-volume big research on Thai society. So like that, Cambodia, Laos, in Sri Lankan Buddhist society, there are quite a large number of sociological studies, like Richard Gomrich and Gananath Obesekar did a lot of research on Sri Lankan Buddhism. And 2000, one scholar called H.L. Seneviratne did a research on Buddhist monastic tradition in Sri Lanka. He published it in the Chicago University Press 2000. And then some other scholar did a research, and his research publication was title was Colors of the Robe. And like that, there are large number of sociological research on Buddhism done by scholars. So, I mean, about Sri Lankan, if you are looking at Sri Lankan Buddhist sociological studies, there are large number of research done on Sri Lankan Buddhist society. Okay, I think I gave you some idea about the three aspects of Buddhist research. I started my discussion with defining what a research is, and then I said that research is a production of knowledge, producing new piece of knowledge, something that was not there before. Pubbe ananusutesu dhammesu, just for you to remember. And then we looked at textual studies, and then I emphasized to you constructing, reconstructing a text, and then interpreting and understanding the text. Now, these are only just ideas. you really have to go into depth of these things and see how we can do textual study. And also I said that textual study provide the basis for other type of studies, so therefore it is important. And then we looked at conceptual studies and also sociological studies. In conceptual studies, I highlighted the challenge of understanding different context concepts in their different context, historical context. Now, the Buddhist terms we are using, Pali terms, are very old terms. But when we translate these terms into English or Sinhala or Myanmar or any other language, we are using modern language. Now, methodologically, that itself pose a very important challenge. Two forms of language, we need to be very careful. And also equally important when you translate into like Western language like French, German, or English, because those languages had a different history, different culture. So the meaning of English, French, or German words come from their culture. Meaning of Myanmar or Sinhala words come from Sinhala culture or Myanmar culture. So, putting just two concepts together, this equals this, is very something to be very careful. And then finally, we discuss sociological studies, where I underline the significance of going into the society and drawing conclusions. Okay, large majority of you are venerable, so monks and nuns and sialis, other scholars. So I think I will wind up at this point. Again, thank you very much, Myanmar Student Association of Sri Lanka, the 7th annual Makutaram Research Seminar. So the floor is open for discussion. But I think the problem is I somehow or other, even though you can hear me, I can't hear you. So what should I do? If you want to have a discussion, maybe you can write down and show me the questions, or I don't know, something gone wrong. I can't hear any of you. I can
Hello.
see you, but I can't hear you. So what
Hello.
should we do?
I think Professor cannot hear.
Venerable Rattasar, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So okay. So
What is going on? Actually, I can't.
may I take 1 minute? Hold on a second.
Okay, Venerable Sumangal, go ahead. Ask your question. Yeah, this would be good. You can write it down. Anybody who has questions, kindly write it down. What key principles or methods should be used to analyze conflicting translations and grasp the authentic meaning of Pali text? Let me repeat that question. Venerable Sumingala, what key principles or methods should be used to analyze conflicting translations and grasp the authentic meaning? I think, Venerable, that's I would say, very important question. Now, when we are looking at translations, we find all different types of translation. For the one and the same word, two translators give two different terms. Now, your question is how should we judge, and then what are the principles we should follow to judge? I think some concerns we need to be keeping in our mind is that we need to see uh, using what type of context, whether any particular translation has been made, because you can translate the same thing in many different ways. However, if we want to decide which is the correct translation, any particular discourse or any particular statement, not only statement of the Buddha, any particular statement, we need to know the context. Now, if you know the context, now, Reverend, particularly important thing is in Buddhist tradition, we have this idea of Nitatha Desana, Neyatha Desana. Nita Atha Desana and Neya Atha Desana. Now, this is the same thing. I mean, Buddha says that if you confuse the two, if you think that Nitatta Desana to be Neyatta, Neyatta Desana to be Nitatta, Buddha says that that person is destroying my teaching. Because it is so important for us to know which meaning Buddha meant when he used the term. I will give you an example from Burmese tradition itself. In 1960s and 70s, between Mahasi Sayadaw meditation tradition and Sri Lankan meditation tradition, there was a debate. Actually, there was a big debate about Satipatthana method. I mean, it's a very big debate. I don't want to go into the debate. But the point I want to make is ultimately this whole debate rested on each party saying to the other party, look, this particular statement by the Buddha is not Nitatta but Neyatta. Other party says, no, it is Nitatta, not Neyatta. Because both parties quote the same statement by the Buddha. But one party, Burmese party says, no, this is Nitatta. Sri Lanka party says, no, this is Neyatta. Now you see that it's very, very important whether a particular thing is Nitatta or Neyatta. But how do we know whether the particular thing is Nitaatta or Neyatta? It's very difficult. But you look at the context. For example, Buddha says that there is no something called Satto Jivo Atta. Okay? Nisatto Nijivo Sunyo. However, having taught the Dhamma in that manner, suppose Buddha were to say to Venerable Ananda, I am thirsty, bring me some water. Now, how can you understand that statement by the Buddha? Is that Nitatto Neyatta? On the one hand, Buddha says, Nisatto Nijivo Sunyo. What is that? Is that Nitatto Neyatta? And when the Buddha says that Ananda, I am thirsty, bring me some water. What is that? Now, if Venerable Ananda says that, okay, who is I? Who is getting thirsty? Who want to drink water? Now, that will be disastrous because what the Buddha meant is neyatha. I mean, very ordinary sammuti conventional language. When Buddha is thirsty, Buddha would say, I am thirsty. But on the other hand, Buddha, when the teaching Dhamma, Buddha would say there is no satta jiva putkala. Now, Venerable, so the answering your question is not very simple, but I think very important to know the context. Because sometimes we go by the etymological meaning, but etymological meaning is good, but etymological meaning doesn't mean every time we use a word, we have etymology in our mind. No. For example, if you say to refer to dog, you say sunaka. But if you look at the word sunaka, good nails. But, when we say dog or in Pali, when we say sunaka, we don't think about the nails. We just think about the animal. So if you go by the etymological meaning and say that, oh, he is saying that the animal with very good nails or something, that may be not correct. Because the speaker doesn't refer to nails. He means just the word used in society to refer to a dog. So I think what your question is a very important thing, but need to know the context and need to also know the different types of nuances of the word and different interpretations. I gave you the example of Brahmana. Now, Buddha would use the word Brahmana, but very often Buddha would give a different meaning. Buddha would use the word atta, but gives a different meaning. So therefore, there is no very simple rule. Okay, this is what you need to do, but you need to be cautious. And when you really look at the text. Okay, that is what I can say. And then there is next question is Venerable Tikkanyana. What is the most... oh, that question disappeared. What happened to it? What is Venerable Tikkajana's question? It disappeared. Oh, he removed it to what? Okay, let me go to the next question. When we study research, the conceptual understand and practical understand, which one do we follow for research? In fact, there are two things. When you do a conceptual research, primarily what to do is we try to understand the concept, different meanings of it, different ways of using it. What is the place of the concept in the context? Uh, Secondarily, or another aspect would be going to the application of that society, not necessarily social application. Like if you take a study like you take tanha, raga, kama. Now, in English language, you can translate all these three concepts calling craving or desire or whatever. But if you do a research on tanha, kama, raga, although in a way all three can refer to one thing, one particular state of mind, but different aspect of that state of mind can be kama. So kama is different from raga, raga is different from chanda, and any other thing. So kama, raga, lobha. Now lobha is defined in Abhidhamma in one manner, kama refers to another. But Kama, Raga, Lobha, on the other hand, are not different from each other. All three can refer to the same type of mentality. But on the other hand, as a researcher, you cannot take Kama, the Lobha and Raga as exactly synonymous, 100%. They can refer to one thing, but they can mean. So meaning and reference. The word has a meaning, word has a different usage, but it can be referring. Now, for example, in order to refer to the Buddha, we can say enlightened one, we can say the one with 10 powers, we can say well-gone one. Each has, it is different meanings, but each term, all terms together collectively refer to the Buddha. So you need to know the distinction between meaning and the reference. Words can have different meanings, but with different meanings, they can refer to, they can connect to a particular object. Okay, so this is the difference. So therefore, in conceptual research, you can basically look at the concept, its development, its history, and then also important to see how it is practiced. Now, you talk about lobe, how to get rid of lobe, that will be practical aspect. How your lobe is improved, how get rid of lobe, how you get rid of lobe through magga and phala. Those are practical aspects. By practical aspect, I don't mean only society, but even within your own life, those things can be the proper issues. Okay, Venerable, let me go to Venerable Tikkana's question. What are the most common weaknesses that examiners identify in MPhil or PhD textual studies? Well, the second is a very requires lengthy answer. In fact, in the textual studies, there are some pitfalls, where a person who studies can fall into. Now, particularly the difficult area where examiners find is, your interpretation and translation. Now, you translate a text. Actually, translation is an interpretation. Without interpreting, without having some meaning, you can't translate. Now, this is why one and the same concept can be translated into different linguistic concepts. So, therefore, translation depends on interpretation. Now, the challenge is this: we have to imagine, because as I said earlier also, you have the statement of the Buddha, but Buddha is not, we don't have Buddha today. Same thing with any other author. Author is not there, right? And then we have to go by the text. How are we going to interpret the text? Now, there are several things we need to look at: grammar, style of language, context, history of ideas, and things like that. So, Venerable Tikkanan, I think the most weakness, the like examiners will find it. The student don't give enough sufficient attention to these different aspects. Now, sometimes they simply translate something into English. As I said, Vijnana is consciousness. But of course, Vijnana can be consciousness. Vijnana can be some other things also. So you can't go by. So therefore, the context, is something very important. Okay, Reverend. So that's a brief answer because we need to. Let me look into some other questions. I'm Seelavan's. When we do research as textual study, how to arrange methodology, and what kinds of methods should be included in our research? Now, Reverend, textual research, if you talk about when we do research as textual study, now methodology is you have to have sufficient discussion about text and interpretation, because very often we think that text have fixed meanings. So we just go accepting the fixed meaning. However, research requires you to challenge that fixed meaning. After challenging, maybe you accept it again, that's no problem, but don't accept something without challenging. So therefore, in a textual methodology, today, of course, there are a lot of ideas about textual interpretation, particularly in the post-modernist society. At some point, earlier we thought that the text has, fixed meaning. And also people believe that the author has the privilege. Author can say always, no, this is what I meant. But today, author's privilege is also not very much regarded, because a lot of people think that you take a text and you can interpret the way you like a painting or poetry or something like that. But my idea is different. When you take a philosophy, religion, or for example Buddhist text, I don't think you can interpret the way you like. But at the same time, I would like to say that you must be able to challenge the existing interpretation, and you can come up with your own interpretation. It depends. Now, for example, in the one example I can give you, the Buddha talks about Vimansaka Sutta. In the Vimansaka Sutta, there's a statement called Parasya Cheto Paryang Ajanantena. Parasya Cheto Paryang Ajanantena. Now, usually it is translated as one who knows the how to read others' mind. Tathagate Samannisana Katabba. One should do examination on the Buddha. But in my own understanding, I think it may not be Ajanantena, it could be Ajanantena, one who does not know. All the translations seem to be given one who knows how to read others' mind. But it doesn't make sense. So I personally believe that it should be Ajanantena, one who does not know how to read. So one who does not know how to read the other person's mind, that person should do a examination on the Buddha, whether Buddha is actually Samma Tathagata va Nova, whether Buddha is really a Tathagata or not. Now, this is a textual challenge. Is it one who knows or it one who does not know? Not a very big the issue, but still you can see that textual study has to be done taking into consideration that there are multiple possibilities in textual interpretation. However, that does not mean that we can interpret the text the way we like. Of course, you look at the painting, you can interpret the painting the way you like. You read the poetry, you can interpret it the way you like. But when Buddha gives Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, I don't think this post-modernist interpretation can be applicable. I don't think that anybody can give any interpretation. No, we need to understand what the Buddha said. So our aim should be to reach as close as possible to what the Buddha said. Okay. And don't know really I have time, but let me see. In the term Majjhima Patipada, the Buddha's own created word or social concept like Brahmana and Atta at that time. Please clarify my doubt, dear. Is the term Majjhima Patipada the Buddha's own created word or social? Actually, Majjhima Patipada as a concept, I think Buddha coined the term. But the interesting thing is, the Majjhima Patipada, in a way, whether Buddha meant something different or not, I think it's very close to ordinary language. Majjhima in the middle, Patipada is the practice. Now, that is very different from the example I gave you earlier, Paticcasamuppada. Now, Paticcasamuppada, the meaning is not very clear like that. But Majjhima Patipada, I think you are right. Maybe Majjhima Patipada term itself is also created by the Buddha to give a particular meaning. But the terms themselves are quite familiar, like the term Brahmin. Buddha used the term Brahmin in order to give a different meaning, but the term is quite familiar. In the same way, Majjhima Patipada separately can be familiar. However, Majjhima Patipada as a combined term, maybe it is correct to say that Buddha coined that term. But Atta, Brahmana, these terms Buddha used, but at the same time giving new interpretation to them. Then I will go to Panyachari. What factors should be the basic of conceptual framework? What factors should be the basic of conceptual framework? I mean, it's a little bit difficult question, because if you take conceptual research, I think your framework will be made by asking some important questions. Okay. Now, if you take concept particularly, I would say you begin with what is the history of this concept? What is the history of this concept? How did it begin? When did it, the was used? In what context? In other words, you can always start the conceptual study by looking at the origin and the history of that concept. That is important way. And then another thing would be to go to different instances and then study, try to identify in these instances whether the concept has been used in one sense or in different senses. Now, for that, you have to look at the context. Okay. So, therefore, I would say briefly, conceptual framework will be beginning with historical and then going to language and etymological and then going to philosophical or dharma meaning. For example, if you take karma or kamma, you can see how kamma, how old is karma, what are the ideas, very first usage of karma in the Indian tradition, and then, what are the usage of these things, uh, things like that, where you look at origin and the different contexts. I think that is what I can you in brief. Let me go to the Chintita Alankara, Venerable Chinta. According to the Nitatta and Neyatta methods, can we say that the teaching from the suttas, for example, have transformed individuals into Abhidhamma, Puggala Panyatti? Let me read it again. According to the Nitatta and Neyatta method, can we say that the teachings from the suttas, for example, have transformed individual into Abhidhamma, Puggala Panyatti? Actually, let us see. I'm not sure exactly whether I understand you, but what happened really in Puggala? What is the Puggala Panyatti? Puggala and Puggala Panyatti. Now, again, we have to take the Nitatha, the Desana by the Buddha, when Buddha say that Satto, Atta, Puggalo, Nathi. I mean, there is no Satta, Atta, Puggala. Okay, now in other words, no Puggala is there. It is only a Sammuti. So, having said that no Pudgala is there, interestingly, in the Abhidhamma Pitaka, you have what is called Puggala Panyati. Now, Venerable, you have to understand what is the term Panyati. Panyati means concept. Now, although we translate concept for the easy, for our convenience, actually Panyati means making something known. Per nya. Panyati is a noun, making something known, making something communicated. That is the Panyati. So, in other words, simply we say that Panyati is a concept. Panyati is a word. So, I think in Puggala Panyati is a collection of all the instances where term Pudgala can be used in a neyatha sense. I mean, we can debate on this, but that is my idea. So therefore, if you take the discourses where the Nitatta sense, Buddha denies that there is no sattva, there is no Pudgala. But on the other hand, if you look at the Pudgala Panyati, now where the content of Pudgala Panyati come? The content of Pudgala Panyati come from Anguttara Nikaya basically. Buddha talks about, oh monks, there is one person, there is two person, there is this person who is born in the world. Now, all these things are neyattha desana. On the one hand, Buddha says, no sattva, no Pudgala. But on the other hand, Buddha talks about Pudgala. So therefore, it is very important for us to know the distinction between the two ways of using the concept. So therefore, in the Abhidhamma literature, Puggala Panyati is really a manual or collection of all the instances where Buddha uses Pudgala. So I would say the application, the use in Puggala Panyati is all the instances to be interpreted as Neyatha. Okay. And let me go Bante. According to you, compared to other types of research you mentioned, can sociological study be considered as a more practical and valuable thing? Whether the question is whether sociological study is more practical and more valuable. Actually, sociological study can be more practical, but whether it is more valuable, I don't want to give a judgment, because philosophical study can be also very valuable, very very good conceptual study. But what is the significance of sociological study? Sociological study has the value of realistically judging what is said in the book. Now, of course, as my example was, according to Buddhism, if you define a lay person, definition would be lay person is a person who observes 5 precepts. But that is the definition. However, if you want to know whether really lay people are living according to that definition, you have to go to the society. So it is very important to look at the society and understand the society in order to, if you want to change the society for better. So, Reverend, sociological studies are valuable like any other research, but it can be very useful. Like theoretical study, maybe you do and you write a dissertation on conceptual philosophical thing, and you keep the book in the library, and it may be. But if you do a sociological research, and then if you give the results of that research to policymakers in the country or in the society, then they can make policies. So in other words, sociological researches are very important in the sense that they can be used to making policies in a society, making policies in the country. So in other words, practical information. Okay. And we'll go to the next question. When we do sociological research, I think we need to do surveys. Then how do we construct survey questions systematically while Buddhist institutes do not offer sociology subject? And can we do conceptual research together with sociological research as a hybrid? Okay, starting from the last part of your question, you can always do a hybrid. As I said, textual study, understanding the concept is very important to do sociological study. So you can do a hybrid study, there is no doubt. about that. And a lot of people do textual study combined with other things also, textual combined. Now you can take a text and you can analyze the text, interpret the text, and then you can examine it doctrinally. I have seen many researches done by European scholars. They take some ancient text and they take only one or two chapters, and then they reconstruct the chapters, and then they do a conceptual study. Okay, that is for your second part of the question. The first part of the question is actually very important because usually Buddhist departments in universities do not teach sociological aspect. So either you have to, if you are in a university, you have to go to sociology department and follow some courses or follow some. But in my own experience, we usually talk about methodology. We teach sociological method also to students, or we invite some sociological researchers to Buddhist studies. So therefore, I think that is a weakness sometime in our departments that has to be corrected. If our student, if we let them go to sociological research, we really need to teach them how to make surveys, how to prepare questionnaires. So, I mean, personally, I'm not a sociologist, but, when some of my students want to do that, I get them to look at their questionnaires, and I examine their questionnaires. And making a questionnaire, always, you ask a question in order to get some particular information. So before you make the question, you need to know what information you are going to get with this question. So that is very important. So anyhow, that's the how we need to do sociological research. I do agree with you that we need to teach sociological research method. Okay, Venerables, I like to wind up now. Maybe I will take one last question because I have spoken 2 hours now. My name is Bhikkhu Sopakasa. Thank you for your lecture. The English language is a historical development that occurred within a theistic cultural context, such as the concept of God, soul, and salvation. Nibbana is linked to the concept of anatta. Is it truly possible accurately convey or explain the meaning of Nibbana in English? So if so, I think that's a very interesting and very challenging and important question. In my whole discussion, I think Venerable Sopak and also all the listeners, I tried to highlight to you this cultural gap between context. We are using English language. This is why we need to be remembering the cultural context. Now, I will give you a different, very popular example. Now we talk, I mean, even I myself use the term Buddhist soteriology. Now, if you take the word soteriology, the dictionary etymological meaning is soteriology comes from the word soter. I think it's a Greek term. Soter means savior, one who saves you. So soteriology means actually the doctrine about the savior. But then how can we talk about the Buddhist soteriology? Actually, that is a contradiction in term. In a way, you can say that you can never talk about soteriology because Buddha is not a soter. Buddha is not a savior. That's not the function of the Buddha. So at one level, you can say that, no, you can never talk about Buddhist soteriology. However, we need to understand the words in a language gradually gets different meaning. Now, today, a specific meaning of English word soteriology comes from soter. However, another alternative meaning for soteriology is the study of any religion, the final goal. So in that second sense, we can use the concept of soteriology in order to, do research. Now, you see, this is the challenge. Now, if you take the Nirvanic experience, I think it is very, very important to be able to use language very carefully. Now, if you look at the history of Buddhist studies in English language, for example, take suffering. Now, suffering in English language is basically not a philosophical term. I suffer from cold, I suffer from headache, like that. However, in Buddhism, important thing is suffering. Dukkha has dukkha, sankara dukkha, and so on, several different meanings. So even in Buddhism, dukkha can be used to refer to dukkha, but at the same time, dukkha can be used into sankara dukkha. Now the important thing is when we write in English language, in the Buddhist context, the moment we use suffering, now a lot of readers know that they are not talking about the suffering we get when we have a cold or headache, but suffering is used in a different Buddhist context. In other words, word suffering has almost become a Buddhist term now. So in Buddhist context, when we use it, people know that this refers to the first noble truth. So in what I'm trying to tell you is, in a way, it is very difficult to talk about nirvana in English. But if we cannot talk about nirvana in English at all, then talking to English people or Western people is useless. But we know that that is not the case. Ultimately, with even inadequate language, we can get people to come closer to the experience. Now, the people who come closer to the experience, they can say, even you can use the word that, that, even the word that can refer to the nirvanic experience. If two people talk about it, it's like that. So therefore, languages are not fixed. Meaning of language are not really, written on stone, okay? They also change. Now, from that point of view, we can say that although it can be misleading, we have to talk. Otherwise, we can't make people understand. Otherwise, even we will not be understand, because English, your argument for English language will be equally applicable to Myanmar language, equally applicable to Sinhala language, because we are also using Nibbana in our own terms. So therefore, I think we don't need to be hopeless. There is hope, namely because we must be able to convey the meaning. The bottom line of the conveying meaning is the shared experience. Nirvana, at least if we come close to it, to the experience, then both of us know that what we are talking about. But this is a challenging one. Okay. Now, Venerables, actually, I take this as my last question. Okay. I'm sorry because I don't have time to answer all questions. Thank you for sharing with us. When defining the research problem and research gap in humanities and Buddhist studies, how do we ensure that our no, Reverend, that question disappeared, but I will not be able to answer any other questions because I would like to wind up from here. If I can see that other question, I would give you a short answer, but here I have... Venerable Tratasar, I think I would like to wind up the discussion at this point. Maybe we can have a separate occasion to discuss. I'm sorry, because there are a lot of questions, but I don't have time to do that. So sorry, Venerables who had questions. So I will wind up, and thank you so much for everybody who asked questions and who listened to me. And hopefully you will get answers to your questions, because there's a whole series of discussions. Venerable Rattasara and all the organizers, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I can't hear what you say, but okay.
Yeah,
let
Professor,
me
I
wind
think
up the
you
session.
can hear us. It's okay. So type. So the Professor is already out. So what is the next, or what we have to do? Okay. So
And
can you
I think we
can you give me 1 minute? Would you mind?
Yeah,
you
Huh?
can go. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay. Because I just want to And just 1 minute, not very long. So thank you very much for all the attendance, and thank you for your patience. So this is very great opportunity. Then we have learned a lot of things and a lot of experience. So that is very much good. And I was supposed to introduce about Professor Asangal. I think some of the students are already familiar. So he is a really one of the philosopher. Like he the PhD, the comparative philosophy, the Nibbana and infallibility. So from the University of Hawaii. So it's a really good chance. So we are deeply sorry for inconvenience of technical issue from the Professor Sangha side. So thank you very much for all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I don't want to. Yeah. I don't want to take time more. Yeah. Thank you very much all.
So thank you so much, the Naika Hamutru. Yeah. So the ties are already finished session. So I went to move to the Bami language. Yeah. Mama Juzu Dumara Fiadu ခုအစီအစဉ်ခန္ဓာအစီအစဉ်တို့6ရက်အကုန်လုံးပြီးစီးသွားပြီပေါ့ဗျာအဲ့လိုပြီးပြီးတဲ့နောက်မှာဘုရားကြီးတို့ခန္ဓာအစီအစဉ်ကိုဗုဒ္ဓတဏ္ဍာစီရန်ထိတိတို့3ချိန်ရုပ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ဘုရားကြီးတို့ရုပ်သိမ်းပြီးဖို့အတွက်ကြောက်လာကြကုန်တော့တန်ခါရရှင်သူမြတ်ဘုရားဆရာကြီးဆရာလေးအားလုံးဓမ္မမိတ်ဆွေများအားလုံးဗုဒ္ဓတဏ္ဍာစီရန်ထိတိတို့3ချိန်ရုပ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ဘုရားကြီးတို့အခမ်းအနားကိုရုပ်သိမ်းဝင်ပြုပါရန်ယူသလေးစားစွာလျှောက်ထားတောင်းပန်အပ်ပါသည်ဘုရား ဗျာနောက်တစ်ပတ်လည်းပဲဆရာအောင်ပြည့်ပေါ့နော်ဒေါက်တာအောင်ပြည့်ထိုးမှာနော်အဲ့ sharing လုပ်မှာဗျာအဲ့ဒါလည်းတက်ပြီးဖို့အတွက်တောင်းဆိုပါတယ်ဗျာနောက်တစ်ပတ်လည်းတင်လာနေပါဗျာ
ပါဗျာ